Well, let's continue with our focus on the drama in the Johannesburg Council, which yesterday failed again to elect a new mayor. That vote now expected to happen on Friday. There's now a report by the team at News 24 suggesting that some ANC councillors in the metro rebelled against their Gauteng leader, Panyaza Lesufi, accusing him of trying to appease the EFF during the attempt to pass through the election of a mayor last night. Let's take this up with political analyst TK Pooe. TK, a very good evening to you. Welcome back to News at Prime. How surprised are you to hear, if this is entirely true, that some in the ANC have had enough with Lesufi trying to appease the EFF?
Evening, Tamegile, and thanks for having me. It really isn't a surprise given, I think, what happened 2 weeks ago at the ANC de Khotla, where it would seem National gave quite a clear directive to say, listen, this issue of trying to appease, I think, the EFF and by extension trying to put, almost overly being smart in trying to say, listen, we're going to support smaller parties to go into the City of Joburg. I think it was called out. So it really isn't a surprise. And maybe the framing of it would rather be, is the Premier actually in line, lock and step in line with what national ANC directives are? Because I think that's probably the bigger and the better way to look at it.
And if indeed there is this suggested rebellion, what would be the possible implications then for a provincial ANC leader who would want to stay the course? I mean, he's only in the first few months, the infancy of his chairpersonship.
Well, I think coming from national, going against national at this time, going into the election, it's not exactly the best thing in the world to do. So I think maybe two calculations might be at play. One, he might feel very confident to say, listen, I can be able to pull this off, and even if National's not happy, they'll have to almost stomach it. But then the second calculation is one, I think, which is probably more immediate. Namely, he, maybe unlike a lot of other members of National and other provinces, actually has the most to lose. If you look at the razor-thin majority the ANC has at a provincial level, he's also maybe making the self-interest calculation to say, listen, I could literally be the last premier of the ANC in Gauteng. It basically makes sense for me to try to appease the EFF in this manner. But again, you should also just be careful to say sometimes to go against the national ANC doesn't always augur well for you going into, as you said, his infancy. I think he's only been in it less than a year, if I'm not mistaken.
And just that then, if it is true that he's basically the premier or the Gauteng chairperson of the ANC bending over backwards to try and make this coalition with the EFF work, that desperation, how will that pay off with the voting public when you consider that the relationship with the EFF and between the ANC and EFF is a contradictory one, right? Because at national, they hurl insults at one another, but when you look at Gauteng, they want to work together to run these metros, and we're now hearing that the party with more votes, yes, it's not an outright majority, is doing more than it should, according to some of its councillors, to keep this relationship afloat.
And I think that probably is the real problem, namely, how much do you give away? In as much as the ANC, yes, look, it's an easy win at the moment of local government to say, listen, if we work with the EFF, we might be able to get it. But the bigger question you're asking is not so much how national would view, but how would voters view it? And from what we've seen, and look, I can only work with the data that we've had from the last few general elections, is that most voters are not ready to equate the ANC with the EFF. If anything, there might be more of an argument to say that the ANC should be working with the D, as I've been arguing. So really, it's one of those things to say, is this simply an ideological thing? Or if you really have been following Mr. Panyaza Lesufi's career, he's almost boxed himself in to say he can never work with the DA, which almost says, listen, are you putting your ego ahead of the party? Because if it's about party, the logical argument is to say you might have to work with the DA because that gets you at, I think, above 50% in Gauteng, if not beyond 50%. Because the EFF is still, and I think sometimes we forget this, they're not the official opposition. They are still either the number 3 party or the number 3, and I think the number 3 party in places like Gauteng. So that calculation, I think he's making it a bit harder than it actually should be.
And it's interesting, isn't it, because at national level, from the recent National Executive Committee meeting, the ANC said that one of the things that it's exploring, for example, in dealing with coalitions and building stable arrangements to that effect, is that the parties basically with the highest number of votes, which would be, on the current calculations, the ANC or the DA, depending on who wants to get together, they're saying those people should basically run the government or have a say in how a metro would be run. Can they do that? Can they really continue with a set of politics which say that if I've got the highest number of votes, I should have the majority say, the majority stake?
Well, that's more wish than actual legislation, because we have to kind of look at it this way. The South African electoral system does not allow for that. So unless that changes, that argument, it's nice in theory, but doesn't really mean anything. What we currently have and what they currently need to face is the fact that, listen, no one got 50%. Yes, they got a higher percentage closer to 50, but because as the circumstances stand, the most logical argument would be to say, listen, based on legislation, you should be trying to see who can you work with that allows you to really govern. And again, maybe this throws up a different equation altogether to say, is the idea of getting a mayor, or the idea of getting MECs the sole end result, or is the question, how do we come back and actually show that service delivery is possible under coalitions? Because we can't simply wish it away until new legislation is put in place or until a new election comes up. Because the worse this gets, the more voters get frustrated. And I think one of the provisos we as citizens need to start arguing for. I hear the legislation coming from the DA and the ANC about, look, whoever has the highest should be making government. But I think a proviso which we as citizens should be arguing to say, if we see that coalitions are not working, can we quickly have a snap election? Because in the current guise, I think South Africans and most people living in the city of Joburg and other metros where coalitions are not working would really like to say, listen, if we had a proviso which says we want a snap election based on the fact that you're not performing, I think it would shake these political parties up to actually start looking at what's important, which is service delivery to most citizens.
And the refrain from the political parties, especially in the post-2016 period when we saw more of these coalitions coming into effect in the metro areas, was that it's not necessarily a new concept to South Africa. They've worked well in smaller municipalities. But why are the metros so chaotic? What is it about them specifically? Is it a battle for power, a battle for money?
I think it's those things, and we can never get away from the idea of resources in South Africa. Look, I think basic human nature says if you and I are only fighting for 10 Rand, eventually you and I are going to agree that, listen, how do we split this? But if you and I are fighting for millions, well, the calculations become a bit different. And I think what we do know about South African politics, and we cannot get away from this, is that's what I'm saying. I'm always hesitant to call it coalitions. I think it's more, how do you and I scratch each other's back to get an outcome? Because if you notice, the first principle they seem to always argue over is who's going to get what position. It's not, listen, when it comes to service delivery, what is your ideological leaning? Well, look, I'm the ANC, I'm a centrist and leftist party, so I do care about, under-resourced areas. Look, I'm the DA or I'm the EFF and I come from X region. That should be the calculation of how, because the budget should determine what's happening. But what we have is what I said, the get along to get along club, not a coalition. And it's always what position do you want? And until we move from that refrain of what position to what policy position works best for a city, and can we get along with that? I think that will become better. Maybe that's why it works in more rural areas, because the resources are such that they can only be directed towards a few things, as opposed to a place like City of Joburg, which has $1 billion and above as its budget.
Are any of these parties really negotiating in the best interest of the voting public, as they claim to be doing?
Well, I think looking at the fact that is it the fourth, fifth mayor we're going to be going through, I think you lose track sometimes of what mayor we're on. I would say it's not in the best interest. And I think the worst thing, and this is also one of the things that's really going to come up, is when voters and citizens start to lose faith in political systems, where do they turn to? What history tells us is, the number of people participating declines, but it also tells us that people start to look for more extreme measures to get representation. And I would hope that political parties would be aware that once people start looking for extreme measures, they become obsolete, and it's not really the best course of action for South Africa's development, considering that we're still in what I might argue is a poor state of economic development, even in places like the city of Joburg.
TK Pooe, political analyst, good to speak to you as always. Thank you for your time.